All right, everybody, Scott Stevens here on another perspective where we're going to talk revolution. The east you go, and still hanging on to the AM as you move to the west on this lovely planet of ours that is so beautiful and so ugly all at the same time. And I suppose that is probably the reason for it is for a diversity of experience, even though diversity seems to be the issue that we're all fighting and struggling against, even in this moment. Either there's too much of it or not enough of it, depending on one's, of course, entirely variable point of view. But I want to talk about something that seems to be in the air, and I had a rather interesting encounter over the weekend. Good to see you over there, Vicky. From some folks at a park, at a local park here, and they were some Antifa folks, and it was my literally my first encounter. I've been aware of them since the Trump election when they made a rather dramatic appearance on the scene and were given oodles and oodles of press. So some power structures behind them. Otherwise, they would remain unknown because those subjects, those topics that want to be pushed into the limelight, and if they've got money and if they serve an agenda, then they will get the headlines, as we all know. Those topics or those subjects of discussion that want to be suppressed, they just never get any press. And the Antifa crowd is getting lots and lots of press. So somebody is behind them. Good evening, afternoon. So I want to kind of roll on into this. I know you guys are probably exhausted from a long coffee break show. It was a great show to get everybody kind of going together, but we'll roll on this anyway. And so let's talk revolution. And in my eyes, and after my recent experience, I don't see that there is another way around this. The forces are too aligned. The cycles seem to be primed for such an event, and it's just something that I'm now firmly of the opinion that we're going to have to get there. We're just going to have to go through this experience. So, as the V for Vendetta has kind of been priming us, the elites have been priming us through the media. The Sons of Anarchy, the show, this has been part of the plan. And it's been part of the plan probably since the United States was brought back under crown control after the War of 1812, and certainly after we became a corporation in 1871. But revolution was the goal. The question is why, and then who does it benefit? And that's something we've got to go through. And one of the things that came up with the Antifa, as I did some research and image gathering and then contemplated the why, is that is an aspect of anarchy. And I would be lying if I didn't say that I was personally interested in anarchy, because the control structure that has been in place in the United States, and for that matter, the Western world, has been oppressive, absolutely oppressive in restricting free speech, how we're educated, what kind of energy we use and must use, that there is an agenda and a structure that we are absolutely allowed to live within. When we step outside of those bounds, then we have issues, and we find out who we can't discuss in a disparaging way. We discover what technologies are not allowed to flourish, even though the environment is crying for change. We discover who is controlling us. So anarchy is kind of a curious concept, but one that these last 3 years has certainly demonstrated, at least to my eyes, that we are not ready to deal with. And so I'm going to preface this with this statement. I am aware of and I am grateful for the strengths and past accomplishments of each of those candidates that is presently running for president, and also their respective parties. However, I'm also keenly aware of the multitude of weaknesses that are inherent within each. We can see the problems and we can see what solutions parties pretend to bring to the table. I mean, in 2008, we were sold a whole lot of hope, and we were still wondering where the delivery was when the previous president left office. And so this is also something that I completely agree with. The whole system is guilty. Right, left, corporate, all of it. It is all guilty. And so when you've got this kind of sentiment out there, there is no way outside of going through a cleansing. there has to be some kind of cleansing. There has to be some kind of accountability that is brought to the table. And this is what the nation, and indeed the whole world, appears to be hungry for, is some aspect of accountability. So how do we bring change when all of those parties are guilty? And then how do we not harm our fellow man? All right, so I kind of been making some notes over the last 2 days. So how a revolution is begun begins with discontent. And then that brings about a willingness to participate in civil discord. In the history, and because we're all kind of curious as to what the CIA does behind our backs, and we know that they are always active behind our backs and have funded, have fostered, have put up campaigns, and have put in puppet leaders for what are termed color revolutions. If you're not familiar with the term, it's worth your time to go discover how our own intelligence agencies, the CIA in particular, which by statute is forbidden from participating in U.S. politics, but not so outside of the country. And so color revolutions are a fascinating period of research. And then you've got to wonder, and we'll get to that, might we in this country be experiencing a color revolution? So then there's a different kind of revolution, which is simply subversive. We're kind of going in underneath and then getting our people, or the revolutionaries' people, inside government slowly, but consistently. We continue to work from the inside out, and the Constitution has, let's just say, the oath of office has a place for this, where you're dealing with enemies both foreign and domestic. Then without hatred, none of it goes anywhere. It just falls flat on its face. There has to be some kind of emotion in there to push these things. And then, of course, perceived inequalities, and those can be fostered. And obviously, we've got an income equality. That's a given. We've got, from housing inequalities, we've got education inequalities. Equalities exist. And as Karen just said, all of these things have existed since the beginning of time. So why have revolutions only happened periodically? Probably, and my quick reply would be because of expedience, because of the powers that want power at the other side of it. And we'll get to that as well. And these inequalities, these inequities can be very brief, lasting just a few years. Maybe they've lasted generations. And in some long-suffering populations, say for Rome, for example, these inequalities lasted for hundreds upon hundreds of years. And probably before this last election, we understood and kind of felt inside that revolution was coming. Was it going to be an evolution, or would it be a revolution? And either way, it's fated to come apart or come to us. And so this is something that I think we've shifted from an evolution, where the love and light people would like to take over and just bring in, more goodness, if you will, or those with guns and bullets, because this one was simply taking too long. So that's kind of what seems to be. And we'll go to Venezuela. You can tell that by the flag, where you've had the CIA who has wanted access to their natural resources. And so they've tried to instill new leaders. They have tried to come in with subversive tactics and assassinate, either by drone, as we've seen on video, or by poison. So either way, they're fostering some kind of revolution. But there's always some power that is desired at the end. And for Americans, there's been a lot of students who have deep in debt because of their education, and then the inequities that were certainly in place after the '08 crash, where we bailed out to the banks to the tunes of hundreds of billions of dollars, and honestly, if not trillions, when we begin to dig deeper into the shadow banking system. So the population has a right to be up in arms. There absolutely is a right. And so let's go back. Let's go back a couple of years, and we had some candidates that stepped up. They created the movements. They articulated a plan upon which people could get behind. And that is how movements begin, is you give them an ideal upon which they can hang their coat and then get behind. So we need a political revolution in this country, which means that 80% of the people vote, not 40%, and which means that people demand that Congress represent the middle class and the working families of this country, and not just the billionaire class. This has been the battle cry since the beginning. It was the battle cry from the Bolshevik revolution. It was in China in 1949. It was always to get the popular people to move from one side to another, to begin to get engaged in political action. That was the need. And indeed, without that movement of the middle class, it won't happen. It cannot happen. So that's kind of what was able to what Bernie was able to do. So then we have to back off from the revolution aspect, the propaganda, if you will, and ask who benefits, who organizes, who funds, and then who gets the power at the end. And in the case of Bernie Sanders, the people would benefit. And who organized? Well, Bernie and the people. Who funds? And the people did by lots and lots and lots of small donations. Then who gets the power at the end? Well, that should have been obvious, that it would have been Bernie Sanders and then those that he would have brought in to help run the administration. Because as Trump learned, you can win the Oval Office, you can win the executive branch, but the state, which still exists, remains in power. So you may have a captain at the helm pointing in a direction, but if the helmsman doesn't change the wheel to shift the rudder in a different direction, you're not going to tack in a different direction. And if you don't have men in the engine room shoveling coal, if you will, into the burners to keep the pistons going and the propeller, the churning, then the ship isn't going to go in that direction. So you can have the helm of the ship, but that doesn't mean the ship is going to go off in the direction that you would inspire the people to move to. So this is what a political revolution looks like. And the man did gather millions. It was an inspiration. But apparently, because he didn't get the nomination the last two times, that there was who benefits, that first question wasn't going to be satiated or answered correctly by this man winning the movement, because he undoubtedly, at least in my opinion, would have won that election. So then democracy goes through a cycle. It's a minimum of 200-year cycle, and there are absolutely other sub-cycles that undulate underneath this larger cycle. And so bondage usually leads to a revolution. And we have faith in that movement because we can see brighter days ahead, and that always fosters great courage, resulting in, at the end of the revolution, some aspect of greater liberty or perceived freedoms, real or imagined. Nevertheless, the fire has come out of the bondage. And that usually that freedom, that ability to produce to your own talents, your own skills, leads to a personal abundance. And then the nation, the neighborhood, the city-state also shares in that abundance because you have it to share. And ultimately, that abundance can lead to selfishness. Not entirely, but there are those that with generations of power then can hold on to, say, oil, to say farming, let's say fishing. You can have these industries upon which monopolies are then built. And then those monopolies end up and lead to a complacency because they're not working for the workers, working for those that allow for the abundance to come into place. And then the apathy takes place because either the employees get paid enough, the rich can continue to get richer and to collect, and then the dependence upon those monopolies ultimately leads to a further bondage. And then we've got to go through the whole cycle once again, but that ultimately is generations down the road. So most of those today that are born-bred Americans don't have an experience with revolution. They've been teased by Bernie. They've been teased by the anti-war protests in the Vietnam era, but they don't have the direct experience with revolution. So the question is, with revolution, you go from democracy to what? We move in a revolution will take us from socialism to what? Communism? A further state controlling of all assets? Because usually we're going from democracy to socialism and from socialism to communism and then to a dictatorship where you have the party leader or even the party structure itself upon which nuclear power plants, farms, all of those industries which produce for the population and produce for export are then run by the party. It is a collectivism, but that doesn't mean that the spoils outside of the life necessities are then shared with the people. And then even from monarchies, France was in a monarchy, in a monarchy when the French Revolution happened, and that ultimately, if you look down the way, just a generation, did not end well. So you can either go from a benevolent or an oppressive monarchy to something else, and then from a theocracy also to something else. So this is the question. Revolution brings a change from your current system into something else. The question is what? And so what we've done and what I've seen happening is we're casting a stone. We're creating blame. We're creating victims. So right now what I see in this country is we're casting a stone across time to create victims. And we're using race as that card. All right, the conditions present before a revolution occurs. People from all social classes are discontented for whatever reason. Everybody would have their own specific reason to be discontented. People feel restless, like they're being held down by unacceptable restrictions in society, religion, the economy, or the government. And oftentimes it is all working together to keep the people down. People remain hopeful about the future, but they are being forced to accept less than they are hoped for. And we see that in the younger ones. They go to school with the hope of a job, of an income, of the ability to make friends, and more importantly, at least in my case, was to make a difference. In some way or another, make a difference in the world. And that can lead to how and why they choose the education upon which they're going to base their life's service upon. All right, so the tools of a revolution. I had to put fear first. And fear often leads to anger because you're afraid of something not ending or not getting any better. But then with anger, will muster the power and the courage, warranted or not, to create change, to create an action. Intimidation is usually a result because you're wanting something to stop. You're wanting to impress upon another person, upon an institution, upon a government or corporation that you won't stand for what has been happening any longer. Then the media has to be in the game. If the media wasn't in the game, if we didn't have news running what was happening at Mount Rushmore over the weekend, there would be a lot less anger in the population through this past weekend. So the media, through both print, song, and stage, creates kind of a complicity and an ability to maybe do things and talk about people and point fingers that we wouldn't necessarily do otherwise. And then with it all together, we ultimately will see gangs. And with gangs, we end up with more fear. And in these gangs, when they all get together, when their purpose is unified, there is absolutely an exhilaration. And that can be very powerful. It can also be very, very destructive, as we have begun to see walking the streets. France has been under protest from the Yellow Jackets for over a year, but for different reasons, different causes than here in the States. And so we're in the process of creating the victim, casting a stone across time. And that has to do with racism. That is the topic that we're dealing with right now. And it's interesting to see the race composite of these people protesting. So we've almost in a way turned whites upon whites to achieve the end. All right, so this comes from a handbook, and there's a couple of pages. There's 3 in total. Social media is now the new battlefront of ideals. Whose ideals, I might ask? We've seen that kind of power by these outlets yield by kicking major fascists off their platforms before. This will and must only continue. If you're seeking a position of power in the media, be sure to obscure and hide your true identities, your true intentions on the various social media platforms. Better to remain a mystery and wield massive power than blatantly shouting your viewpoints from the hilltops. We have the objective truth on our side. Always project that. Use social media as a baton to slap down anyone who holds fascist viewpoints. Call them a racist, homophobic, misogynist, and create an echo chamber around you. What is an echo chamber? That's just simply when you hear yourself. You hear your same vote. And so when I had the encounter with these Antifa people 2 days ago, there was no rationality. We literally could not have any kind of discussion. It could not happen. And I asked, well, what's the goal? What happens after you, quote unquote, burn things down? Who's going to rebuild? And in what image will you rebuild? And there were no answers. There was no answers, just more anger that we have to literally, it was as a quote off this banner, drive the Trump-Pence regime out, to get that effing fascist out of the White House. That was the goal. So it doesn't matter who goes in the White House or what power gets in the White House. They were simply intent on this particular goal. That was it. That was all. And so I have to question, just kind of as a rational man using a little bit of intelligence, one doesn't destroy a structure without the plans already in hand for the replacement. If you were to ask a city, well, let's go back and let's just say an architect that wants to build a structure, but yet that spot over there, 3 blocks down, 2 blocks over, we need to level it. So they need to demo the building and then prepare the soil, sink a foundation, you run the utilities, and then build the structure. You don't tear down what is there without the architectural plans already in place. And that has been my question. What goes in its place? If we're going to tear this system down, and I don't want to be a defender of it in the least, but what goes up? Is it going to be something that is beneficial for us all? So there's a couple of pages. Now, maybe I need to be on this one first. Phase 3, imagine a world free of hatred and bigotry. And this is from the Antifa handbook. There's such a thing. Imagine a world where you'll never have to be called the N-word again. Imagine a world where you can be gay as you want and not be called the raging, where Antifa ideas reign supreme, and all hateful microaggression speech is eradicated. One way to accomplish this will be to tag or microchip every human being on the planet, and they will do so voluntarily. Use the guise of entertainment and other benefits to lure the people to this end. This chip embedded in the hand or the neck will allow the Antifa-approved regulators to monitor the citizenry of the world. Information accessible by waving a wand a few feet away from the chip would be DNA content, including the percentage of color, the genetic disadvantages, etc., one's political leanings, scored by past social media posts, earnings, known associates, Antifa status, etc. We must ensure that only Antifa-approved regulators can access this data, lest we veer too far into fascism ourselves. Basically stating, we'll get close, but not quite that close. Thus, with the wave of a wand, one would be able to tell whether that vaguely beige-ish-looking person is allowed to use the term the N-word. For example, a rap lexicon in a popular way. Where are my N-words at? I've got hoes in different area codes. While clearly misogynistic, a person of color has the right to use that term. Antifa regulators would have to determine an acceptable percentage of threshold of color in one's DNA that would make it acceptable to use the term. If you're only 17% of African descent, perhaps it's not okay to use that term. So it's really kind of scary. It truly is more like a fascist regime that they would like to set up. Our movement would eventually spread out into other nations. Indeed, it has already begun. Some people will prove excessively resistant to our brand of Antifa, such as those who were previously burned by communism or failed socialistic states. But make no mistake, we will prevail where others have failed. Their leaders' lust for status, power, and wealth eventually lead them to create layers of power full of corrupt state officials. Antifa have the power of the people on our side, or we will eventually, and will not succumb to such a state. So container ship after container ship will be converted into massive passenger cruise liners and will ferry poverty-stricken brown people from around the world to the former United States and Western Europe. Jobs will flower aplenty at all the world's worker-owned businesses, and those who can't work will be provided with a stipend and an unlimited supply of opiates, marijuana, meth, and cocaine to occupy their free time. Sound too good to be true? It isn't, and this is what you are fighting for, and this is what we believe. We are Antifa. Either you are with us or you're a fascist. And of course, you wouldn't want to distribute this to white males, non-people of color, or non-LGBTQ. And of course, use your common sense. So that's kind of, made me a little more curious about ultimately what their goal is. And this movement absolutely has momentum. And as a result, And that momentum is a result of the energy that's already invested, and the energy apparently continues to grow. So, believe it or not, these people have actually been tricked into thinking that they're actually fighting fascism when they ultimately can be the cause of it. And a revolution is also a revolution in cycles. So we may end up descending in this for a bit. It might be a bit painful, but like every winter, there's a spring that comes. And so after the French Revolution in the early 1790s, 1789, I believe exactly, and so France went through about 10, 12 years until 1800 when Napoleon had ruled with other consuls. But in that same year, people had approved another new constitution which gave Napoleon sole power of France. The French Revolution was coming for a cycle, full cycle, with beginning with a king and then ultimately ended with a dictator. And this is why I'm so, a little anxious about it, is because who does Antifa have behind the wings, ready to come on in and then be their leader? And if there's 5, 10, 15% of the population that's willing to follow, that becomes, and especially if they're violent, that becomes a very, very impressive mob mentality that most sane people would simply rather just get out of the way of rather than confront head on. Ultimately, it would lead to collective farming, and I saw some rumblings of this to where they would use greenhouse gases and environmental concerns to shut down individual farmers, even ones that own their own land, for this quote-unquote climate crisis. So we've got to learn the difference between fascists and, say, anti-fascists. Fascists beat people that they disagree with, and anti-fascists, of course, beat people that they obviously disagree with. And the difference between then and now is almost zero. Almost zero. The only thing that's different is the nation and the decade. That's simply it. And there's a foothold that is taken in place, and as we continue to defund the police, we defund the rule of law, even though that law may be unjust. We're opening ourselves for mob rule, and that, to me, is probably the biggest thing. And the revolution obviously will be televised, as we have seen that's just going to be the case, that the revolution, and we're all going to see it. And so the question is anarchy, and this is kind of where I started. And if I had to choose a party, I would kind of want to identify with this, just because of it at least having the allure of the ultimate freedom. And one of the mottos is, it's better to die on your feet than to live on your knees. Who would disagree with that? If you're hungry, I will offer food. If you're thirsty, I will offer water. If you're cold, I will offer warmth. If you are in need, ask, and I will give help. If you're in trouble, I will help. I do not do these things in the hopes of being rewarded. I do not do these things out of fear of punishment. I do these things because I know them to be right. I set my own standards, and I alone enforce them. I am an anarchist. I kind of wish that there was more of this offering when we see them together in cities. Anarchism is founded on the observation that since few men are wise enough to rule themselves, even fewer are wise enough to rule others. Again, it seems to be a truth that would be kind of difficult to argue with. So the Antifa meme below is blowing up on social media today because it says exactly what needs to be said about this terrorist group. If your ideology makes you hide your face, then you're a coward. And I'm kind of sensing that with ISIS, ISIL, however you want to call it, there has been kind of a desensitization to those in black and masks and roaming the Middle East. If you're interested in who funded them, that's kind of an interesting rabbit hole to go on down. Look at what was it, Hornet's Nest or Hornet Swarm. It was an interesting project that ISIL actually was to upset the Middle East and to create discord and literally to create the movement of a disaffected people into the West. So we come back to, if it's anarchy, then the shining ideal. We must have space. This is what I kind of wanted to settle this out with last night. So the shining ideal, we must have a space inside ourselves large enough to allow others the freedom to live their lives. And if we're to be anarchists, then we need to allow this space inside us to have others, or to allow others also that freedom that you're so violently claiming for yourself. We must have space inside ourselves large enough to allow others the freedom to live their lives. And if anarchy is to be the future, then this needs to be the ideal, not one where you cannot hear the thoughts, the speech of another, but to allow them that space to grow. So then, who deserves anarchy? That responsibility required to be a true anarchist is full accountability for one's thoughts, feelings, and actions without exception. So then, if this is the bar to be met, who deserves anarchy? And I would have to say no one yet has deserved that part of anarchy. We're just not there yet. Maybe a decade, maybe in a century, we will have evolved enough to where we can see one another as human beings that anarchy can be practiced. But in the meanwhile, anarchy is probably best practiced alone with yourself and allowing others to live their lives how you would like to live yours. All right, just some thoughts for this Monday afternoon. Yeah, this is a heavy topic, guys, and we're all going to go through it one at a time. And maybe there'll be a grand unifying event that we can avert some of the worst of these things. I don't know. And I don't think anything can be promised at this point other than that we will probably all be tested very, very close to our limits. All right, thanks for stopping in on another perspective. I'll do a little bit of a weather break-in and kind of wrap up what's happened around the world over the weekend as far as weather's concerned. And then Vicky's Coffee Break Show will be hitting the air tomorrow at 11 o'clock Mountain. Everybody, thanks for stopping by. I'm Scott Stevens. Hey, keep looking up.